Hi, in this lecture, you will learn why and how to handle the exceptions in the functions and procedures. When you create functions or procedures that are called from another procedure or function, or anonymous block, etc., you need to be aware of the effects of the unhandled and handled exceptions. We know that if we have a begin-end block in somewhere, we can have an exception section in there too. This is also valid in functions and procedures. Besides, we know that when an exception is raised in a block, the control immediately goes to the exception section of that block. But if you have handled that exception, what if you do not handle an exception? What we have seen up to now is we had an error and the program crashed because we did not call any procedure or something. We handled the exceptions in anonymous blocks, and if we did not handle, SQL developer showed us an error and finished the executing. But in the real work, you face with the exceptions, especially with the procedures and functions. And we know that we use procedures and functions by calling. So if an exception happens in a function or procedure that I called, and if it is not handled in it, what happens then? If an exception is not handled in the called subprogram, the exception is directly raised to the caller. That means as a caller program, even if I did not do anything wrong, I will have an exception and my code will also finish executing. So if you don't handle the exceptions in your procedures or functions, your function or procedure will cause an error in the caller subprogram. Let's say that you created a function that returns an employee based on the employee ID, and you did not handle the no data found exception. If the programmer who calls that function does not handle that, his or her program will also have an error. But notice that the programmer cannot know all the exceptions that may occur in your function. Actually, normally the programmer does not care about it. So you should handle all the possible exceptions, or you intentionally raise the exceptions if you really need it. I mean, all the control must be on you. On the other hand, if you handled all the possible exceptions and an exception occurs in your procedure or function, that exception will be handled in the exception section of your function or procedure, and the caller program will not be affected badly on this error. Great. Now you know that if you don't handle the possible exceptions in your functions or procedures, it will cause the caller programs to have unexpected exceptions. So you should handle all the possible exceptions. Perfect. The usage of exceptions in the subprograms is all the same as the anonymous blocks. We write exception section right before the end keyword of the begin-end block. No difference. Alright, now let's open up the SQL developer and make some examples for that. Assume that we have a stored function named getAmp in our schema. And in this function, we did not handle any exceptions. Now we will see what happens in this situation. First, we will start with creating our function. This function is the same function that we did in our local subprograms lesson. So let's create it as a stored function. I simply write create or replace function get underscore amp, and amp num is employees dot employee ID person type, and our return keyword and employees person row type, and our is keyword. Amp employees person row type, and our begin keyword. Select all the columns into amp from employees, where employee ID is equal to amp underscore num, and return amp. Great, we know that function already, and we think that this code is good. It seems there is no problem. We did many examples on that and had no problems, you know. So let's create our function then. Great, our function is ready to use. Now we will type an anonymous block that will use that function. This anonymous block uses that function, gets the employee, and prints some of the information of that employee. Now let's type it. Declare. We know that our function returns a record type of the employees table. So to store the returning value, I need a new employee record. Let's create it then. v_emp is employees %row type and our begin keyword. Now let's simply print something to point that our code started running. I write dbms output dot put line and let's say fetching the employee data. Now I will get the employee 110 by using our new function. v_emp is equal to get emp and the parameter is 110. Now, as we have the data of the employee, we can print some of the information of that employee. Let's print then. Let me copy that and paste in here. Let's say some of the information of the employee are, and let's write the name of the employee is concatenate that with v_emp dot first name. Let me copy that all and paste in here and write the email of the employee is v_emp.email. And let's paste again and let's say salary of the employee is v_emp.salary and our end keyword. Great, now we have our anonymous block. It uses our function and prints some of the information of that employee. Now let's run our code and see if it works. Perfect. We could get the employee from our function and print some of the data. So far, so good. However, what if I write the employee ID 10? Because we know that there is no employee with the ID of 10. So let's do it. Clear up, write 10, and run it. As you can see, we had an error. The error says that no data found at hr.getEmp. It says that we have the error in the object getEmp, not in the anonymous block. However, even if this function had an error, this also caused my anonymous block to crash. Actually, as the anonymous block creator, this is not my fault. I simply tried to call the function and get the employee, but this exception broke my code too. Alright, as you can see, the anonymous block could type the first dbms output, but the rest of the outputs are not written. Because we know that when we have an exception in somewhere of the code, the rest of the code is not executed and the control is directly passed to the exception section. If there is no exception section, it will be raised to the caller block. Now, in here, the actual problem is in our getEmp function. But since we did not handle that problem in that function, it raised that exception to the caller. In here, the caller is our anonymous block. Actually, this could be another function or a procedure too. If the caller is also called by another one, and if this exception is not handled in the caller too, that exception would raise to the other one. This would go on like that until one of the caller blocks handles it, or until the last caller block throws that exception to the SQL developer or an application like that. So to avoid these kind of problems, we need to handle that problem at the source. So we will handle that exception in our function. Now, the first thing that we need to do in here is finding the problem and the source. Now we can see from the script output that the problem is no data found and the source is our getM function. Besides, there is one more important info, which is the problem causes at line 5. This does not show the exact place all the times, but the problem will most probably be in this line or in a few lines close to that line. The second line number, which says at line 5, shows the line that the caller block had this exception. In which line of the caller block had this error? It is the function call, because we know that since we did not handle that exception in the function, it raised that error to our anonymous block. And since we call it in line 5 here, we have that problem at that line. So let's open up our function declaration then. Functions and our getM function. And check the line 5. We see that we have a select int clause here. And our problem was no data found exception. We know that no data found mostly happens because you try to assign a value from the select statement into a variable. We can easily see that, luckily in the line 5, there is a select int clause. This may be the source of that problem. We select the employee and assign it to our emp record. But right that time, when we try to get the employee 10, since there is no employee with the ID of 10 in the employees table, it could not find that and returned the no data found exception. Since we did not handle that problem in here, it is raised to the caller. So let's handle it and see the effects. We know that the exception handling in subprograms are all the same as handling with the anonymous blocks. We simply write our exception section right before the end keyword of the begin end block. So let's do it now. I simply write exception, and we know that we have the no data found exception. So we need to handle that exception. I write when no data found, then it's enough to print that there is no employee with that ID. But in the real work, you can take some other actions like deleting the things that you did uncommit or inserting some useful log data, etc. Now let's type it then. Let's write dbms output dot put line, and let's say there is no employee with the ID of emp underscore num. Great. Now let's compile it then. We handled that error now. Now let's turn back to our anonymous block and run it again. Let's clear up and run our code. But we still have an error. It printed the text in exception section, but it returned an exception anyway. When we check the reason, it says PLSQL functions return without any value. And there are some more details on the calls and the action areas. These are very useful tips. You should also read them. In here, it simply says that we forgot to return any value, but functions must return a value in any cases. The line of that error is line 11. So let's open up our function and check that problem. When we check the line 11, we see that there is only the end keyword. But the end keyword cannot have an exception. So we can easily understand from here that it returned an error since no return statement is executed until that end keyword. So this causes the problem. But we returned the emp record above. Yes, we did, but since an exception occurred before the return statement, that statement is not executed and the control passed to the exception section. So we also need to return something in the exception section too. This is necessary since this is a function. But if you create a procedure, you know that you don't return anything. Great. Since we need to return some value, we can simply return a null value. So in the anonymous block, we can easily understand that there is an error. So let's do it then. I simply write return null here. Fine, let's compile it. And go to the anonymous block and run the code again. As you can see, it worked fine. Since our anonymous block is not terminated because of the exception, it continued running. But since there is no employee with that ID and our function returned a null value for that, all the values are printed as null. But notice that the string in the exception section is also printed. So even if an exception occurs in the function, the caller anonymous block is not affected on this. On the other hand, you may throw the exception after handling it. For example, when you have the error, you may want to insert some log data and then raise the error to the caller program anyway. We can do that too. So let's see it then. We can raise any type of exception here, but we will raise no data found since this problem is related with no data found exception. So let's write raise no data found. Great. Now let's compile it and go to the anonymous block and run it again. As you can see, even if it printed the message that there is no employee with the ID 10, it raised the exception to the caller to pass the control of that problem to the caller block. Great, everything seems fine. However, still there is a problem. We have the no data found exception and handled it or raised it. What if we have another exception? Actually, you need to handle all the possible exceptions if you don't have any reason to raise it to the caller. We, as the programmers, handle all the possible exceptions generally. This must be a programming habit for you. So in here, we may have handled the no data found exception. But if any other exception happens, our anonymous block will be terminated again. So we need to use the when others then exception handler for any cases. So let's simply go to the function declaration and type that. I simply write when others then, and let's dbms output something. Let's say something unexpected happened. And return null. Normally we need to return something in here, so I write return null here too. Great, now let's compile it. Now our function controls all the possible errors. So the caller blocks or subprograms will not be affected badly by that function. Great. Now we know why and how to handle the exceptions in functions and procedures. Actually, we did our examples with the functions because there is no need to show with the procedures. The usage is all the same except the return clause. In functions, you need to return some value in the exception section too, or you need to raise the exception to the caller. But in procedures, you don't return any value or you don't need to raise the exception. So it is easier. Alright, this is the end of this lecture. See you in the next one.